We are live. I would like to welcome our trainer extraordinaire from Canine Compass in the ACT. For those who don't know where that is, because you might not be in Australia, that's the Australian Capital Territory. Who would have thought that that's our actual capital and not Sydney where I live? Now, this is Alyssa Rankin. She's NDTF trained. So she has a great source of education behind her. What I really, really love about NDTF training is that they train you in pretty much all disciplines, and you get, I guess, such a broad amount of information there. So I love that. That's awesome. Now,
it's pretty good.
We're going to be, yeah, it is. We're going to be talking today about nutrition and behavior. But what I really want to get from you, Alyssa, is your experiences that when you've been dealing with clients. I know that you talk to them a lot about nutrition. Tell me why you decided to talk to clients, your behavioral clients, about nutrition.
Yeah, most of my clients is behavioral stuff. I do a little bit of obedience, but usually they're dogs that are struggling in themselves anyway. And it just made sense to cover nutrition with us when we're struggling. Nutrition is the first thing that people are talked to about improving. If we've got limitations, getting rid of sugars, preservatives, flavors, additives, all of that stuff to help out get ourselves online. And so it just makes sense to apply that to any living being, really.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, you deal quite a lot with foster dogs as well. You're a bit of a tragic like me. You always seem to have a dog there. And I think that you also, because you're a trainer, you also get sort of lumped with the special needs dogs as well.
Yeah.
Have you had your own sort of first-hand experience about how changing nutrition of those incoming dogs have actually helped with their trainability and, I guess, general behavior?
I think I'm sure, I have no doubt that that's the case, but then it's really, I suppose, tough to gauge the absolute given the amount of work that they're also having put into them. So it's not just diet, it's just like diet and exercise and training and, you know, boundaries and, you know, how to operate within society, generally speaking. So absolutely, I know that I feel that it impacts a lot in terms of them just generally being able to operate well, and then that impacts on learning, as well as if there's any additives that might be pinging off things, or knowing that there's no carbohydrates, it's going to be, you know, feeding their chaos kind of thing with all the sugars that get broken down and stuff. So knowing what's in there is definitely something that I think impacts a lot on their learning. Yeah.
I think that's such a good point, because even something as simple as a dietary intolerance can, I like the word, I think you said ping, can really get dogs pinging all over the place. And we know it from, you know, parents who have children, and I'm not just talking about artificial food colours and things like that, but there'll be certain foods that they eat, and the parent will be very well aware of how immediately or how quickly that child's behavior starts to change. And you go, okay, they can't have that, you know?
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Yeah, and intolerance, I think people often think, oh, and an intolerance to a food is more about like they get itchy skin, or they get loose stools, or things like that. And we often forget that it can also come out in behavior as well. So that's a really interesting point. Yeah. When you're dealing with your clients, what do you think the main thing is that you're saying? What's the biggest challenge that the average client has with their pet dog?
Most of my clients, like 80, probably I reckon 85% of my client base is reactivity in dogs towards other dogs. So that's the most common thing for me, other than, you know, the average Joe Blogs have problems usually with a recall, like a dog, so a dog coming back or loose lead walking are the two most common complaints, generally speaking. And then for the one-on-one stuff, predominantly it's overwhelmingly for me the dog reactivity stuff. And then there's, you know, separation related issues and stress and all of those sorts of things as well that kind of interlay in there, of course.
Yeah, if I was to push you about the reactivity, I guess you're talking reactivity to other dogs?
Yeah, predominantly.
Yeah. Are you mostly seeing, I know it's probably hard to sort of nail it down, but are you mostly seeing that behavior due to being overstimulated, or it's a fear-based response? What kind of thing are you usually seeing?
Well, statistically, it's over 90% it comes from a fearful base within the dogs. And so then there's the layers of stress, but then there's also the other influences, you know, the over social guys that just want to go and party. Definitely arousal levels and overstimulation impacts on all of that. And then there's obviously the minute percentage of guys that actually genuinely want to go and have a serious crack, but most of them it's just about either creating distance and putting on the display to not get in that situation, or wanting to go and party and having the tantrum in the lolly aisle because they can't get their chocolate, you know.
Yeah, I hear you. I think the fear-based stuff is super interesting, because I think we're starting to see a lot more of that than what we probably used to see.
Yeah.
Do you think that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on why we're seeing that more and more?
I think society, the way that we've changed, because all dogs now are just in their backyard unless we take them out. So before, they used to just accidentally get exposed to everything and anything that was in the big wide world because they were around a lot more and we were out and about a lot more. Whereas now a lot of the time we're just in an office and we come home and they're at our mercy of what they're exposed to, generally speaking. And then that impacts on everything else in terms of what they consider to be like a fearful thing or overexciting. We don't invest in teaching them what we want them to consider normal and to be fairly neutral about, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, that's my theory behind it. And then also, you know, back in the day, we didn't breed with dogs that had average temperaments. Like, they were put by the wayside, right? And now that's not so much a big thing anymore. Like, we had far less tolerance of like delinquent dogs, for lack of better terminology, like dogs that had problems back then. They just weren't catered to, let's say.
Yeah.
And then so now we're far more forgiving in all of that stuff, which I don't know whether that's a bad thing, but then there's dogs that are very compromised in themselves that are still being bred with and passing that on as well.
Yeah, and I think that leads to another question, that behaviour is a result of like a genotype and environment as well.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I think sometimes we forget that it's not just one or the other. Like, we might go, oh, you know, the bloody sire of this dog, he was a nutcase or he was aggressive and it's his fault. But we also have to understand that our environment turns on and off switches, and part of our environment is not just the environment that we see, but also what we expose them to in terms of what's in our house, what we put in their bodies and everything like that. I think a really good example of what you were just talking about before, about in the past we probably wouldn't have bred with dogs that probably weren't quite up to par. Dogs often were bred by families because they had really lovely temperaments. And that's a common thing that you would hear back in the day. Oh, you know, such and such is such a lovely dog. That's why we want to get a litter out of her. Whether or not that's an appropriate thing to do, or it's okay with our ethics these days. But generally, that's what used to happen. We weren't looking at them in all these other different ways. It was just like, you know, Sally's a lovely dog and we should give her a litter, or such and such is a really good sheepdog and we're gonna let him produce. If Bob wasn't a good sheepdog, then Bob doesn't get to reproduce.
Yeah, exactly.
But for instance, in my own breed, and it's actually really interesting because when I say about my own breed, I'm in New South Wales, and we do have a very high volume breeder here of my breed. And what's actually happened is that there are all these dogs now that have these really soft temperaments that are very fear-based, and they're more likely to fear bite. So these are also often kennel dogs, so they don't actually live in home environments where they've actually been exposed to that. So the people who are breeding them don't actually know what they're like in home environments. They haven't left the property and all these kind of things. So there's our kind of genetic link that we have there to go, well, all these dogs are now being bred and put into family homes, even though genetically their temperaments are quite weak. And also they're probably, the nutrition going into them is quite weak as well, because that's still an area that we're learning a lot about. So I think that's super interesting. When I speak to other people within my breed throughout the country, they are seeing that as well, but not as much as what we're seeing here in New South Wales. So it's super interesting where you see these little clusters appear because a temperament isn't quite right, or the nutrition we know out of that kennel is not very good as well. So I think the two coming together is really interesting, and it's one reason why I've decided that after the long period of time that we have been in the breed, that I'm not going to do it again, because the breed now is not, it doesn't display the temperament that I'm happy with, even though I'm trying to do my best at, the environment and the nutrition. It just doesn't work for me. So I think we've got so much to learn.
Yeah. There's also studies now in terms of, stress in pregnancy, and all of that sort of thing, and how that even impacts on temperament. It's definitely not like breed specific, and it's definitely not all in how they're raised. It's like like an organic kind of combination of the both of them, and then other influences like stress levels and stuff during pregnancies and things like that.
And talking about pregnancy, I'll skip to something that I was reading a number of different studies. I always have all these manila folders around about nutrition and behavior and all these kind of things, and let me find out what it was. Here it was. Okay, so omega-3s. So a lack of omega-3s in pregnant or lactating bitches can really affect the brain and the vision capabilities of her offspring. And what's really super interesting about this, for those who have followed me on the Balanced Canine, they may remember a very special needs puppy that I had called Ian. And he was a little Great Dane puppy, and I got him at 7 weeks. And everyone, I think, kind of laughed at me because they didn't think he was a Great Dane. They're like, ha, 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 you don't know what you're talking about. He looked like a Chihuahua cross. He was 1.9 kilos on arrival at 7 weeks. And for a Great Dane puppy, he should have been anywhere between, say, 8 and 10 kilos. What I found really interesting about Ian, his nutrition was horrendous. He was the runt of the litter, and in an effort to try and really help him, his breeders, who were backyard breeders, had been feeding him really inappropriate diet of roast beef and crumpets, I think it was. So it was just it was a really inappropriate diet. When he got here, he wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at anyone. It's just like he just wasn't there. It was really strange, and I thought, oh goodness, like, what have I done? What have I taken on? And it probably actually took him a month to actually look at me, like actually look at my face, even though I would try and play with him and get down. He just wasn't there. And his learning took a long, long time. He didn't leave until he was about 7 months of age. And to give like a comparison, we just had a foster dog leave called Agatha, and she's 8 months old. And within a week, we had already applied for her Tricks title. It's such a different thing. Yet with Ian, there was just no way. He just was not capable of that. His early nutrition was just so horrendous that I don't think he had the mental capabilities to be able to go there. So if we think about perhaps the diet that his mum got, it probably was really deficient in omega-3s and just, God, everything else, and that really related to that. Now, I'm really lucky in the fact that I actually see Ian's sister, her owners bring another dog to me as a client. So I actually get to see what she's like. And you know what? She's really similar to him as well. So they're really quite fearful and stressy, and a little bit over the top as well. And you really have to sort of go, well, I wonder how things would have been if their nutrition was a lot better back then. So, the day Agatha arrived with me, which is the little foster dog that we just had leave, I had her on a supplement called Antinol. Now, Antinol is traditionally used as a joint supplement in dogs affected with arthritis, but it actually is multimodality. So it has actually this ability, because it's so high in omega-3, is that you can actually be giving it to your puppy to help with their trainability, or your older dog to help with their cognitive decline as well. So did that help Agatha in her trainability? I don't know. Or was her diet? I know her diet wasn't great, but it certainly wasn't as bad as Ian's. But I really have to sort of wonder that giving her that extra opportunity, I didn't know about Antinol, or Antinol wasn't available back when Ian came to me. If it was, I would have had him on it straight away, even though he was transitioned to a fresh food diet straight away. You know, he was just so nutritionally, I wouldn't say nutritionally abused, even though they didn't mean to, that it wrecked his opportunities as a dog.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you know, incredibly sad. I want to bring up a study. Now, there's been a number of studies that have been done in relation to animal behavior, and they're not all in dogs. A lot of them are done in rats, obviously, as well. But there was this really interesting study, and it got published in 2017, and it has a big, long name. It's called Effects in Dogs with Behavioral Disorders of Commercial Nutraceutical Diets on Stress and Neuroendocrine Parameters. That's a big, long name. Now, the type of study this was a randomized controlled clinical evaluation of both genders of different breeds who had behavioral disorders related to anxiety and chronic stress. Now, the dogs were either fed a control diet or a nutraceutical diet for 45 days. So in the greater scheme of things, 45 days isn't that long to be hopeful to see behavioral changes, I think most of us would think. Now, the results. Now, the nutraceutical diet is the one that is the enhanced diet with better nutrition. So dogs on the nutraceutical diet show significant increase of serotonin, dopamine, and B endorphins. So those are all the good things, and a significant decrease in all the bad things. So this study actually demonstrated for the first time that a specific diet significantly and positively affected things like the neuroendocrine parameters. And it almost seems like common sense, but it took this study, the first of its kind, to go, hey, if you change a dog's diet to really focus on bringing more serotonin and increasing dopamine into their diet, that can actually positively affect their behavior. So the owners of these dogs that had these, I want to say chronically ill, because I think anxiety is definitely an illness, they were getting these amazing results in 45 days. So I think that's, you know, pretty awesome. I want to lead into another study that is a tryptophan and protein study, pretty much. Now, they found a diet high in tryptophan can lower territorial aggression scores, whilst a high protein diet without tryptophan supplementation can induce a higher dominance aggression score. Now, these studies are always constantly be coming, going, and changing and things like that. And at one point, many, many years ago, and I think it was seen in zoo animals, that they were trying to lower the protein of the aggression, the animals that showed aggression. And that seemed to be working quite well for them. But then what happened is that they didn't kind of realize what low protein diets do to dogs as well. And that is a whole heap of really bad stuff. And that's their general health and well-being, especially their muscle tone as well. So I think they've kind of found a happy medium now by going, okay, well, protein's okay, it's not evil, but if you can actually add something like a tryptophan supplement to it, then you can actually lower these instances of territorial aggression and things like that. So I think that was super interesting because territorial aggression is something that a lot of dogs get themselves in trouble for. So is that something that you deal with your clients?
I don't think many people really ring about it until it's like
they bite someone
often, or escape, or the barking gets complained about too much, or people just think that it's a given. I do get the odd inquiry, and I'm always very thankful for people who do seek help for that stuff. But I think it's just most of the time people, generally speaking, to be honest, when with behavioural problems, I wish people would ring me 6 months before they actually rang me, because most of the time they're at their wits' end and and then the dog's been practicing, just getting worse, all that sort of stuff. And it's once they're fed up, they will ring me and just go. So anybody who gets in early, I'm just like, oh my God, this is amazing. But unfortunately, most people just think that they should be able to fix it themselves, I think, or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's something that I say to people a lot, that first hint of that behavioral problem, and if you kind of know that you're not getting on top of it, that you need to call in a trainer, because if it's 6 months down the track, as you said, the dog's already had 6 months of rehearsing that behavior. Now, so when you come in, you've got to go, okay, so I've got all this rehearsing of that behavior to undo. But then if you're talking to them about nutrition as well, like you sit down and say, hey, well, tell me what kind of nutrition that this dog's on. And if you want to make some recommendations to them, then those recommendations have to then be acted upon, and the dog has to have an ample amount of time to respond to that as well. So it's so much easier if people get in a lot sooner. Absolutely. Now,
I compare it to quitting smoking. I'm like, if your dog's, the longer your dog's practicing it, the longer they've got the habit. You're asking them to quit smoking. Like, one after a year is easier than after 7. But, it's just people, they just don't really think of it that way, I guess. But
yeah, it's different, isn't it?
Then you're talking to them, they're like, it makes so much sense. I'm like, yeah, it does.
It does. Now, could I reasonably assume, and not in a negative sense, that majority of your clients would be feeding a kibble-based diet?
Yeah.
So when I think that, well, we're sort of looking at, I think 90 to 95% of the world's dogs are fed a kibble diet. So when you're sitting down and you're talking to them about it, it's probably the easiest thing to start with is suggesting maybe a high quality kibble. What sort of steps are you sort of taking that are realistic and that are more readily accepted by the clients?
Yeah, I find that a better quality kibble is more easily adopted than going the raw kind of, no, you must be feeding raw and all that sort of stuff. So normally I try and get them to consider, we talk about, mental health and how diet affects mental health generally, but also brain function and, capacities to learn, energy levels, all of those sorts of things, as I said. And, when we're working on a dog most dogs pretty much, we're working on them operating impulse control and willpower and things, and that's a very draining thing. There's the saying of 15 minutes of mental stimulation equals an hour's walk. So that, like, if we think about that and we're asking these dogs to change their habits, across the day, then we need to be able to have a fully energized brain to be able to feed all of that change, because willpower.
I love what you just said, because I'll give you an example of this. So I have a client that I cut the dog's nails, and the dog actually came and stayed with me for about a week and a bit when its human mama was having a baby. So I got the opportunity to do some training with him, because he was one of those dogs that completely flipped out when you tried to do his nails. So we did a lot of training with him. And so now he comes maybe about once a month and we do his nails. Now, this is a fly ball dog as well. So he's used to sprinting and jumping all day long, and he can usually back it up the next day for our second day competition. I may spend 20 minutes with him on and off. It's not like I'm not holding him down. It's really the kind of work that I do with him is like a cooperative kind of care situation. So he makes decisions. I ask him to participate and things like that. So it's probably over 20 minutes. He will go home and he will completely zonk out, because the impulse control and the focus that he has needed to kind of stay with me in this process has just been so utterly mentally challenging to him that he needs to then go home and sleep. And he doesn't do that when he's come home from flyball. So you can see like how challenging dealing with stress and change and things like that is in the dog. And this dog is a fresh food fed dog. So I kind of hate to kind of think, if I was having to deal with him as a dog that was being fed a high carbohydrate diet, how much energy he would have to have with me. And I do see it with my clients that sometimes when I get these dogs that come in predominantly, I deal with a lot of working dogs, and they can tend to be on what they call a performance kibble, which is a very high carbohydrate kibble. I often have to give them breaks every 5 minutes for them to regroup themselves, to chill out, and then we come back again. So it's really interesting to see the difference, that I just have to go, okay, if I push with this dog too much, they can't cope. They actually need to have mental health breaks really frequently. And I'm not cutting their nails. I'm actually just treating them and doing something that's actually really quite pleasant. But just the act of having to have a little bit of impulse control just to stand there for a little bit is way too much for those dogs. So Yeah, I find that fascinating. So the other really interesting topic, I think, probably from a behavioral point of view as well for you, is, you know, a dog that I used to have, which was Dante, is this Harlequin Great Dane. He was a very behaviorally challenged dog. When he arrived with me, he was, I think he was 10 weeks old. That he arrived pink, so he had skin allergies, and throughout his life, he died very young at 5. Throughout his life, those allergies became horrific. They were just awful. And he was predominantly on a kibble-fed diet back then. He did get changed towards near the end of his life when I was learning more. But that dog's behavior, I think, was so largely related to the horrible life and what he felt having to deal with chronic skin disease, and also the medication that actually came with chronic skin disease as well. Is that something that you have to address as a behaviorist as well?
Yeah, for sure. It's one. So I used to talk about, like, I've always talked about health and well-being, generally speaking. And then about a month or so ago, I went to a seminar hosted by Chad Mackin and Jay Jack. They're 2 American trainers who are pretty darn awesome. And they gave me names for shit that I used to talk about, just generally speaking, and always felt like I needed to justify why I was wanting to talk about it. And then I went and saw these guys and I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. So they talk about what's called a layered stress model.
Brittany and I were talking about this the other night, and I think Brittany was either at the seminar you were at, or maybe she was at a different one, because we were talking about this layered stress model and how nutrition and I guess illness fits into this.
Yeah, it's the first layer of stress. Yeah. It's all shit that we used to speak about anyway, but they provided this way of being able to, not convince, but bring the owner on board in terms of consideration and empathy towards their animal, versus it just being this beast of burden that should just be there and do what it's told, kind of thing. And that they're this animal that, you know, is entirely reliant on us to provide them what they need, and yet when they fall short, it's all their fault, kind of thing. So their first layer of stress that they say we need to tick off, which is something that I have always talked about, is health and well-being. So they are relying on the stuff that we feed them, and they can't tell us if they've got a headache that day. And so ensuring that, you know, we know that we're doing the best we can to allow them to feel the best they can. We know when we've got a headache that we're pretty compromised in our patience levels and things like that, and there's no way that we should fairly expect the dogs to be other than the same in terms of, you know, patience and opportunities to practice willpower and the choices that we want them to choose. If we're feeding them McDonald's and they've got a bad tooth, or their hips are sore, or they're, you know, all of those sorts of general type things that can contribute to the way the dog feels, then of course it's going to impact on the rest of the day and their decision-making processes.
Yeah, that is so valid. And, you know, when you say it out loud, it's just such common sense. And I'm sure people sitting there going, yeah, that totally makes sense. And we don't think of those things that, hey, sometimes, you know, dogs have headaches. And it was actually one of my clients that actually really made me think about that. They have a Cavalier who has a condition called syringomyelia, which is an issue where I believe the skull is too small and the brain kind of has to be pushed out the back of its head. And they do get headaches. They get migraine-y type conditions. And she showed me this image. It was a series of images, and it was for Cavalier owners to be able to tell when their dogs were actually having headaches or migraines. So it showed all these different expressions. So owners could actually see, like, it's not just a sad looking dog. They're actually in pain and they're struggling. So that would be a day that you don't take them to agility training or to obedience training and ask them to do all these things because it's just too much. One thing that I see, like, say, for instance, when I'm teaching fitness to dogs, people have a general misunderstanding of what disobedience is versus, like, say, displacement behavior. If I ask a dog to participate and put their feet up onto this inflatable peanut object, and they go, yeah, cool, I'm totally into that. And then 2 seconds later, they're over there and they're sniffing. they're not doing that because they're being assholes or they're blowing you off or something like that. It's just their way to say, do you know what, right now I can't do that. I just have to do this. And teaching people that kind of thing, I think, is so important, because if you're at obedience club, for instance, and your dog is, let's say, effectively blowing you off and is just not paying attention, there could be a health and well-being issue that's actually there. Maybe they're feeling really crappy that day. You know, maybe their digestive system's really giving them a hard time. I mean, you think of us, like if we've eaten something that doesn't agree with us, and that really upsets our tummy, we might get cramps, or you just feel headachy or gross, or you just don't feel up to it. And just because dogs can't communicate that doesn't mean that they don't feel that. And I think that's probably why we feel that they don't have those things, because they don't communicate it.
Yeah, I say to people, we have to learn to listen to what our dogs are telling us. And there's a few, like, that's in health and well-being as much as behavioural change. Like they're very interlinked, and just observing, you know, most dogs aren't assholes. Most of them potentially have learnt that they can be an asshole, some of them. But, you know, most of them are just trying to get by with as little conflict as possible. And my job is to teach people how they can be understanding of that, whilst also reducing stresses and teaching our dog how to make better decision-making processes, instead of just, you know, exploding or stressing out or, you know, biting someone or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're talking to clients and they're kibble-fed dogs, and you're trying to express to them about, you know, that perhaps another kibble might be more suitable, or adding fresh food to their kibble is a really good start. What sort of feedback do you get from people? Do they make the connection, or are they interested in making the change?
Some, yeah. I think when I start to talk about how, you know, diet, like getting rid of the additives and stuff like that from our own diets applies, it just makes sense. When I tie those two things in, you see them kind of go, oh yeah. But then they've got the belief that, you know, they're feeding the best kibble, but it's like the best kibble on the supermarket shelf, versus, and not really understanding the differences. And then there's the ones that are, you know, advocated by certain vets and things like that, who are just being paid to be on the packet. And they're like, but it's, you know, they say, and I'm like, but they're being paid to say that, you know. So then they go, oh yeah. So I kind of get them thinking about it, and definitely send them, I'm not like suggest looking at investing in better quality kibble and understanding how that is, and the top ups in terms of, you know, fresh food and bones and things. And then most of the time I send them to your page and actually say, there's critical analysis of all these different foods. She teaches us how to read ingredients panels so you can understand what you're feeding. And then there's the clients that pay top dollar for, you know, very average food as well, so they understand they feel pretty gypped. And I'm like, you can get better bang for your buck in other ways, kind of stuff. So the guys that are already investing in what they can believed to be really good are very easily educated in terms of options and how they can see what's going on. And then, you know, the other guys, I think I've got pretty good step up in that level of things. Switching to raw
big step
is most people aren't quite there, but I've definitely got clients that have progressed to that since they've been taken down that path of better understanding and all of that sort of jazz, for sure, but not as much.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That's what I think this group has offered, is not having an all or nothing approach. Because I think if you went to your clients and went, look, you're really not feeding a diet that's very beneficial to your dog's overall health and well-being, and therefore it is potentially actually affecting their behavior, you really need to be feeding 100% fresh food diet. And they're like, well, too much, like back up. And that means that they're not even going to look at a higher quality kibble. They're probably just going to stay with what they're doing because they've got their defenses up and they're like, it's not possible. And then it's probably going to interfere with them listening to you with anything else. So I think
actually have a client seen a previous trainer, I'm not sure who it was, who the previous trainer had just smashed her over the nutrition she was providing her. It was a pup at the time, and that she had to do this and she had to do that. And like, she understandably grilled me when she rang for help, because she was just like, if you're just going to tell me this, I don't even want to bar of it. So he put, I think it was he, but I'm just speaking generally, the trainer put this person on the back foot instantly, and she just was just like, you nah. So, and then anything else that they may have covered was just completely vetoed, because, you know, she was like that. They went in on the attack. And, you know, most people love their dogs. They don't intentionally go out of their way to, you know.
Yeah. Especially people that are phoning you. And I find that, like, say, the people that come and see me, I don't get people that come and see me that don't like their dogs and don't want the best for their dogs. And in most cases, they think they are actually doing a really awesome job with their nutrition. And just like you said, they often believe they're feeding the best kibble, but yet it might be the best supermarket kibble. And sometimes just a little bit of a gentle approach to help them explain what's actually in their diet, and there are maybe some easier ways to improve it, can be little stepping stones to better nutrition. It's just like ourselves. You know, I've started eating salad for lunch, but I can tell you that it took many, many years to actually get to that point. You know, I'm not an all or nothing person. It just doesn't work that way. But to give some examples, say if people are in a situation that, you know, they've got a dog that is behaviorally challenged, but they're not ready to make that fresh food commitment yet, there's some different things that you can start to look at about adding to your dog's diet that can increase the tryptophan and serotonin and tyrosine, and all these little different things that can really improve overall behavior over a period of time. So if we look at tryptophan, so it's things like oats, dairy, eggs, fish. There are a lot of the things that we would be adding in a fresh food diet anyway. Pumpkin seeds, which we've actually spoken about in different broadcasts, because they're a great source of manganese, which is seemingly being related to a manganese deficiency is related to cruciate tears.
Yeah, right.
That's super interesting as well. And also spirulina is a really point of tryptophan as well. Now, if people don't necessarily want to go that far and start adding fresh food to their diets, there are supplements. I think Blackmore's Paws actually do a tryptophan supplement as well. I can't tell you how amazing or good it is. I don't know, and I haven't seen the science on theirs. But that leads me to believe that there would be other brands as well that are also doing some sort of tryptophan supplement as well. But like omega-3s, like salmon, sardines, tuna. So even if we can get them eating some like oily fish like twice a week, and in many cases, salmon heads are really, really cheap from the fish shop. So that's also a great way to do it. Serotonin, that's meat and eggs. And eggs can be fed every day. Meat can be added to kibble every day as well. So I think when we think of like fresh food diets, these are all part of a fresh food diet. So it's really just taking these bits and pieces and putting them into a kibble-fed diet to try and give the body better options of food that's actually bioavailable to them. Because what happens in a lot of kibbles is that they contain synthetic vitamins and minerals. And so they're complete and balanced actually when they're in the bag, but then when our dogs consume them, there are actually no studies that show that our dogs can actually uptake those synthetic vitamins and minerals. So when it actually goes into our dogs' bodies, there's no guarantee at all that it's complete and balanced. Now, another really interesting thing is Rodney Habib from Planet Paws actually posted something interesting today. It is an older study, and I remember seeing it ages ago, and I think it's from the UK. They tested over 130 different kibbles, and they all had the complete and balanced tag on them. And I think only a handful of those were actually complete and balanced when they did the analysis on them. So why does that matter? It matters because there's certain nutrients that have to allow the brain to actually work properly. So if they're not getting that through these synthetic vitamins and minerals, or that the kibble companies really aren't being great with what's going into the bag like they're meant to be, then your dog can definitely be getting these nutritional downfalls. And over a long period of time, those nutritional deficiencies are going to show up in different ways, whether that's your dog's behavior or disease in your dog and things like that. So when we add fresh food to a diet, we don't have to worry about synthetic vitamins and minerals and how our dog may or may not uptake them, or place our trust into a kibble company that may actually not be providing us with a complete and balanced meal. So I think that's one really great reason to be adding these ingredients that help serotonin production and tryptophan and all these different kind of things. Now, what was the other thing? Tyrosine, which is an amino acid. Although it's not an essential amino acid for dogs, it's one that actually is quite relative to behavior. So things like chicken, turkey, what's the other thing? Dairy, avocados, bananas, pumpkin seeds again. So these are all really great things that people can be adding to their dog's diet if we want to have a bit of a focus on behavior as well. So there's some little take-home points. Now, for people that are really interested in the science of it, I mean, you can find like these so many studies that are out, you know, and a lot of them are actually broken down from the scientific stuff to just easy to read articles as well. So if you do actually have a problematic dog and you're interested in how nutrition actually relates to behavior, the information is out there. It's widely available. So it's just kind of the point of actually going out and sourcing the information and speaking to a trainer like Alyssa, who actually has an interest in nutrition and can actually see how it's relevant. And I think that layered, what's it called? Is a layered stress model?
Layered stress model. Hang on, I can hold it up.
Yeah, it looks like two mountains, doesn't it?
Yeah, so one's with all the stresses that haven't been dealt with, and the other one you can see, where is it? So if we don't deal with these stresses, the dog's set to explode before they even walk out the door. Whereas if we deal with reducing the stresses, then they're already far away from the threshold before they even walk out the door. So Chad and Jay basically say, you know, even if you don't deal with the problem that most people ring me about and take things on head on, if you just deal with the health and well-being, the lifestyle of the dog, us being consistent and clear, and the lead is often a massive cause of frustration in dogs. And even if you don't deal with, say, the pointy end of the reason why they've rung for help, a lot of the time the dog's so much more fulfilled in its life and feeling so much happier in itself that it's got a much longer fuse to work in the stress areas where they usually explode, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So Chad actually did a live feed the other day explaining the layered stress model. You can follow him on Facebook, and he goes through it, explains it. Obviously, I mean, it's what he talks about, but it's a really cool breakdown of it all. And they give, you know, he was talking about, you know, a dog, average dog, in the sense of their life is pretty average. Most dogs in society, you know, are just there to keep us company. We don't actually think about what they might like to help them feel more fulfilled in their life, right? And so then, you know, on that day, life is a bit of stress. Stress is life. So if we're working on 100 points, we're minus 20 for just the daily stress in life. And then that day's not feeling very well, so we're minus another 10 points. Then we add in the lead frustration, we minus another 30 points. And so then we're going to a new park where the dog hasn't been walked for a month, and so the arousal levels are high. He's set to, you know, he's bubbling away already, and we minus another 20 points. So we've got like minus 80 points off the 100 already before we even start to work out what's going on with why a dog might actually choose an undesirable decision. And then they've got all of the new people and new noises and all of that, and then so you minus another 20, and your dog's like minus 100 before any shit real kind of stuff. And that's
when you break it down like that, and you kind of go, yeah, duh.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's pretty much every dog. Like, And we expect them to choose, like, to just put up with. The older I get, you know, the more I realize the shit we put on animals, like, just in terms of the expectations, whether they're horses, dogs, cows, sheep, like all of the standard farmyard animals, the stuff we expect them to put up with and put them through. And we really don't consider them a hell of a lot in terms of it. That, like, I never used to. It just, they just do, kind of thing.
Yeah, they just are there, and they seem to be okay, or, well, their behavior problem's not too bad right now. We kind of just cope with it, and, you know, and I think it's only in this kind of era now where there's a lot of different fresh food feeding advocates kind of talking, is that people are starting to go, is this actually relevant to my dog? And it's quite funny when I do workshops, especially maybe even a seminar at a club level, I'll get people approach me afterwards and they're like, do we really need to feed them better food? Are you sure? Is it really necessary? And I'm like, well, like, it's totally up to you what you decide to do. But, you know, I would have to ask you, if you were to be fed a processed kibble diet every single day of your life that may or may not have all the vitamins and nutrients that you actually require to function well, is that something that you think you would do well on? Is that something that you're okay to feed your child every day? Like, I'm not a parent, so I shouldn't speak as a parent, but I would imagine if I was a mother that, yes, sometimes children just eat chicken nuggets because that's all you can get into them. But your goal is to get the best nutrition into them as possible, because you know that fruit and veggies are really good for them. And, you know, a lot of mothers do a lot of research on, you know, what helps with their behavior at school and their learnability and things like that. So you'd have to ask yourself, why don't we think of our own dogs in those terms? So if I want better behavior, maybe I have to look at what I'm actually fueling the brain with.
Yeah.
You know, it's really that simple. If I'm not fueling the brain with appropriate nutrition, how can it possibly do the best that it possibly can? And when we talk about mental health issues, us humans think that we're so amazing that no other creature apart from humans can have mental illness. Well, your dog absolutely can have mental illness. And when you look at the imbalances of what we put into dogs, you can certainly understand why their brains that aren't being fed well are going to have these imbalances. So you're almost forcing them into having these behavioral problems as well, because sometimes they're forced into it. They don't actually have an issue. They can't, you know, just with training alone, sometimes it's just not going to work. They need the internal stuff changed as well, you know?
For sure. And I mean, I think it's fair to just be able to apply the vast majority of nutrition guidelines for us across to the dogs, in the sense of, you know, even there's the studies for how fermented foods are having great results for people, for us. And I think it's starting to come out with the dogs as well, yeah, in terms of feeding fermented products, gut health and even gut health impacting on mental health and all that jazz.
Yeah, and that is food, right? So when we're talking about plant matter, especially, like, different fiber feeds different bacteria. And there's so many different types of bacteria that live in our bodies that if we're only feeding the same thing day in, day out, then you're only feeding these certain groups of bacteria. So if you're creating these big gangs of these certain bacterias, then there is an imbalance in there. Everything in our body releases chemicals and electronic pulses. And so if they're getting an overload in one area, then there's going to be a deficiency in another area. And we know that this bacteria has actually crossed the brain barrier. So a really interesting study, and people probably hear about me talking about it a bit because it's from New Zealand and everything New Zealand is cool, is that there was a scientist there that did a study working with people with depression, and she actually did a micronutrient study and got people off their antidepressants. Now that micronutrient mix is available in pharmacies in New Zealand. Like, that is mind-blowing. Like, that's amazing. The study is now being replicated in children. I can't remember with what, I don't know if it was autism or ADHD or something similar. So we really have to understand that what we put into our dog's body feeds that gut bacteria that pretty much controls our whole body. And when we're talking about gut bacteria, the gut health, we probably only, I wouldn't even say we understand 1% of that yet. We're in this age of learning right now about it, and I think in 20 years time we still won't even know like 10% of it. It's just it's mind-blowing. But what we do know is that we need to feed different forms of fiber. Just like, say in a fresh food diet, we're constantly told to rotate our protein, so our meat protein. So you know, you might feed a batch of chicken for a week, the next one you'll do beef and you'll do something else, but sometimes we forget to rotate our vegetable matter as well, and that's really important because that plant matter is feeding different bacteria. So but here's the other really important thing, why we actually rotate the meat as well is because there's pluses and minuses to everything that we put in our body. So if you're feeding just chicken constantly, then that has an out of whack omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and that is creating inflammation in the body. Now, inflammation in the body doesn't just lead to sore joints or skin disease. It's up here as well. It's inflammation throughout the whole body. So if you're creating an inflammatory state in your dog's body, it's really hard for them to perform at their best, whether or not they're a couch potato that you want to go for a walk and then not react to another dog, or actually do high-level competition work with them. So it's also relative, and yeah, I think it's actually kind of mind-blowing. Like I find it fascinating. I think there's so many improvements that we can make in our dog's diet, and it's not just people who feed kibble, it's people who feed fresh food as well, just with a little bit of extra thought about what foods really affect behavior, like the ones that we ran through before. Like just adding some of those on rotation, I think would be an amazing idea, and then actually getting the help of someone like yourself to actually help you work through the technique of the issues that we can't see for ourselves. Like I work with a behaviorist, and I work with you as well. So I will always put my hand up, especially with foster dogs. I'll be like, Alyssa, it doesn't make sense. Like, help me. I don't get it. You need to have someone that's in your team that's going to help you do that. I can deal with probably the nutrition side myself, but sometimes on the behavioral side of a foster dog, I don't get it. And then you might say something, I'll go, oh yeah, that's common sense. I get it. You know, you need to get somebody in to help you with it, because here's the other thing, right? Stress is horrible to the gut system, right? To the digestive system. It messes it up, something chronic. And we know that gut flora plays a massive part in our dog's behavior and in their health. So if I'm allowing my dog to live in a state of stress, then I'm allowing them to live in this chronic state of illness, whether or not I think I see it or not. And dogs who go out on the street and react to people, dogs, cars, any kind of stimuli are living in a state of stress. And I know that's kind of hard for some people to hear, because I don't want you to think that you're being a horrible owner. But it's just recognizing that there are states of stress that our dogs live in, and that it's only fair to get a trainer or behaviorist in to actually help you deal with that, you know?
Yeah, it's crazy what people, I don't know if it's excuse away or don't even, I think we just aren't prepared to put ourselves in, look at it from the dog's perspective. People are just like, well, you know, they're happy, the tail wags, you know, like,
yeah.
So, yeah, as you say, I don't think that it's a malicious action in terms of the feeling that they're letting their dog down, but for sure, it's something that a lot of people could, probably including myself at times, like nobody's immune to this stuff. Like when I think about things over the years and situations, and you know, you kind of go, oh shit. But you know, there's a saying, when you know better, you do better, and that's my motto for sure. And you know, you can only learn from those experiences and not just block them out, because then if you don't learn from them, then you'll likely make the same mistake again, kind of thing. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always think that you keep getting those dogs that have the same issues until you finally sort your shit out and figure out how to deal with it. You know, so actually get help for it. Now, look, guys, we could talk about this forever, but I'm going to let Alyssa actually probably go and walk her dogs or have some dinner or something like that. Now, Alyssa, with you being in Canberra, where can people actually find you? Do you have a website or best on
I
Facebook?
only have a Facebook page, yeah. So Canine Compass Dog Behaviour and Training is my Facebook page.
Excellent.
And I'll have my details all on there.
Cool. Do you do any distance work at all?
I travel up to the mid-north coast a bit. So I'm actually looking at, actually going up there in a couple of weeks. And then I've done a couple of Skype sessions. But if people are looking for help, I've got a pretty great training community. So if people are away or if I get an inquiry, I put the feelers out to find out who's out there and if there's someone who I'm prepared to recommend, kind of thing. So even if I'm not able to, like, I like the personal touch, like in the sense of being able to see what's going on and all that jazz. But I'll do a Skype if people aren't able to find someone suitable, I suppose.
Excellent.
Helpful.
So, yeah, Alyssa's actually in our group, so I think she'd be happy to have a chat to you. You can probably message her from there as well, or a Facebook group. And as she said, she's actually got quite a big network of other professionals as well, so she may actually know somebody in your area too. All right, so I guess the long and the short of it is that if you have a dog with a behavioral issue, is that looking at their health and well-being is definitely one of the first things that we need to do, looking at how we can improve nutrition. And if you don't know how to do that, it's just about reaching out and asking for help. And for professionals like Alyssa, try and get them in at the first sign of trouble rather than 6 months, 12 months down the track where you have so much work to do. But just because you may have so much to do, don't let that deter you from actually getting help, because a dog that's living in, is reacting to stuff or is not happy, is living in a state of stress, whether or not you want to admit it. It's kind of hard to see sometimes, and that is actually going to probably lead to chronic illness down the track as well. All right, Alyssa, thank you so much. I hope you guys have enjoyed today, and I'm sure that we'll probably actually get Alyssa on again, and we'll chat to her then. All right, guys, see you later.
See ya.